Right. First thing we're going to do with any build, after we've got the frame partially assembled, we're going to put the motors on. There's no ambiguity about where they can go. They go in the same place every time. As usual, we're using thread locker. And the supplied hardware would have worked if we didn't have both a soft mount and quad skids to put on. So we're using M3 by 10 bolts to get through both of them. Probably don't need this much thread locker, but that's okay. That is fantastic. So it does poke up ever so slightly, but there is a nice sized gap between the windings and the bolt. So that actually works. Alright, that's one motor down and 3 to go. The motors are on. Unfortunately, before we go any further, we have to deal with this shit. So, we have to cut lengths of this and then melt it. Seems a good length, and it's gonna run around and in like that. So I also have red, and because the wire is red, I'm thinking the red might actually look kind of decent on this, you know? Might look okay. We're gonna that was a huge pain in the ass, and there's still a bunch more to do. I'm not sure why, but that cable wrap I was finding very difficult to work with to get on and off, and to get the shrink wrap over it when necessary. It took me quite a long time and I was a bit frustrated. If you know a good way to work with that stuff, hit me up in the comments. It looks, I mean, it is what it is. I don't have pink filament, man. I can't buy pink filament for a 3D printer. I can't do it. Can't do it. So here we go. So far so good. I mean, I'm gonna be honest, these colors, I don't like these colors, but it is what it is. I just hope this thing flies well. If it flies well, this color scheme can be forgiven, right? Right? Right, I hope so. So we've got the ESC mounted on here. We're ready to wire this up, but first I think we're gonna put the Crossfire receiver in here, because I think it's gonna be a little bit challenging to get in. Once this is wired up, it might be a little more difficult, because I plan on sending these wires kind of like this. So we'll remove this plate, put the wire the receiver, put it in there, and just get it ready to go and ready to be connected to the flight controller. Okay, came right off, beautiful. So here we have the receiver. It is totally unlabeled, so we have to pull up. We'll have to pull up some documentation. Ground 5 volt, channel 1, channel 2. Got it. Black, red, and a couple other things. So we're just going to tin these up first. So while I solder this up here, I'll just run you through a few soldering tips, I guess. That cup on the left with that goo in it is flux. That is your best friend when you're soldering. Always use a pretty decent amount of flux. You can apply it to all the pads that you're going to solder, and it just makes everything happen a lot easier. Use leaded solder when you solder, and just do it in a well ventilated area. You don't want to breathe it in, but it's a lot easier to use than lead free solder. It just melts at a lower point. Aside from that, it's good to get a little bit of solder on the tip of your soldering iron. Even if you have tinned the pads and the wire, a little bit on the soldering iron just helps everything to melt together real easy. And when you buy a soldering iron, try not to skimp on it, because good soldering iron just makes your life way easier. Bad one can just ruin your day. And finally, get yourself a nice pair of tweezers, otherwise you're going to be burning your fingers a lot. What I've got here is some silicone modified conformal coating. I'm gonna spread this on, now that it's soldered up, I'm gonna spread this on the receiver. Got to be very careful here, we're not gonna get any in the antenna port or on the bind button, but we're just gonna carefully throw a coating on there. This stuff will keep it nice and waterproof. It's just a silicone coating that goes over the circuit board. We're going to get both sides. And we're taking note of where that antenna port is, just so that we don't overdo it on this side and have it transfer to the other side. If you make a mistake with this stuff, it's pretty hard to undo. I'm not sure what you can use as a solvent to get it off, but I do know you can solder through it. Not that that's a good way to get it off. Okay, that's more than enough. And now we just wait. This stuff dries quite quickly, thankfully, so we don't have to wait very long. Do this in a well ventilated area, and when it's drying you don't have to be in here. You probably don't want to be in here either. So we're going to let that dry. I'm going to angle it like that so gravity draws any extra stuff down. We don't get it in any of those components that we mentioned earlier. At this point it looks like the receiver fits, but I end up shrink wrapping it, and with the antenna on it wouldn't fit in this iteration of the 3D printed holder there, so I ended up doing a slight redesign to add a little more room and fit it in, but at this point it doesn't work, so we'll just move on to something else right now. Okay, so the Remake of the RXSR holder is printing, and in the meantime here I think I'm gonna tin these pads on the ESC. This will be all I do tonight because I have a splitting fucking headache.
One thing to note here is I have been changing the head on the soldering iron to suit whatever job is at hand. This one, these bigger pads, you can use a bigger head and it transfers heat better. And for smaller stuff like on the flight controller, I use a smaller head and it seems to work just fine. A lot of people just stick with the bigger head, but I find it easier to work with a smaller one if you don't need to work on big pads. For the battery leads, I like to use a lot of solder. It's helpful. It can be a bit of a pain if you don't have a lot of solder on there to get the wires on, especially if you're using a large gauge of wire. Like I believe I'm using 12 gauge here, so needs a lot of solder on there in order to make a good bond and make it easier on yourself connecting it. Here we are back at the receiver. The conformal coating's dry, putting a bit of shrink wrap over it, and then we'll put it in the new 3D printed piece in the middle, and everything should come together.
Should maybe not do this with a fan blowing on the flame, or hell, even use a heat gun if you got one, but I do not. Now let's see if this thing fits or if we need to do further modification. That fits quite nicely. It's real snug. And then this is going to go down here. So now we've got this 3D printed piece. This is going to sit in there quite nicely, and then this goes around the sides. And we zip tie that down. And voila! We've got the receiver mounted. So now we can run the motor wires. Fantastic! I'm excited now. It's coming together. This is the mount for the VTX. This just pops on there. These holes cover those holes as well. So we'll just slide this on just to make sure when we run these wires that that's kind of where it'll be.
It's always a good idea when you're trying to figure out how much wire to use use a little extra. You'll notice I'm not doing this right tight around the post. I'm leaving a little bit extra, and that's just good because there'll be less stress on the solder joint when you solder it up, and if you make a mistake, it's better to have more than too little.
Okay, that's one motor down. Looking pretty good. Ta-da! There we go.
So here I am trying to figure out just how much battery lead I need. When you're trying to figure this out, it's a good idea to grab the battery you're going to be using and place it where it's going to be and see what orientation it's going to need and how long the cable or the wire you're going to need for the battery lead to be. In this case, I needed it to be this long in that sort of configuration because I need a capacitor to fit on the right by the end there, because it wouldn't fit inside because there's just no room with the buzzer nearby. So we ended up going with a longer cable like that. If you plan on adding a capacitor around the end of the XT60 here, when you're removing the heat shrink, just be sure not to cut too deep because you can cut into the wire, which you don't want to do. You just want to cut the heat shrink so you can remove it to expose the soldered connection between the XT60 and the wire.
So now we get to put this capacitor on the battery lead. I think that's the best place for it here. So what I've done is I've cut two small things of heat shrink wrap. When you put a capacitor on, this line means negative, which is black. So we're going to slide that underneath, and we'll be soldering these leads onto the battery there, onto the battery lead. These helping hands things are really useful for all types of applications, and this is no different. So we want to melt. This isn't really working all that well. That looks a little better. That looks pretty good. So I think I'm good with that. Now we just slide these up. So I've got this thicker, heavier duty stuff. This is really good because we don't want this, every time this bends there's a chance, you know, it gets weaker and weaker and it'll break eventually. So we want something to really secure this down. And this heavy duty stuff is quite good for that. Okay, I think that's all right.
So once you've wired up the ESC and the battery lead, you can grab your flight controller, put that on the stack, and then put the rest of the components in place and wire from there. I prefer to put them all down at once because then if anything interferes with something else, you'll know about it.
So we'll start with camera. Okay, that's what I thought. So this here purple wire is totally unnecessary.
When you get your camera, it's going to come with some documentation about where all the wires go, and for the most part, if you're using a flight controller, it's going to have some unnecessary wires, like in this case the voltage sensor, so you can just use the documentation to figure out what you don't need and then de-pin the connector accordingly.
So I mounted the camera, got the wires out of the way. Next up we're going to do this buzzer. Plan is to stick it right in there. Great, perfect, good enough. One of those. So we're going to use sticky tape on here. So I designed this with little slots underneath for the zip tie to go through. 2 of them, and then the original design that was done has these to secure onto those, and then it's just pressure that holds this down. So just like that, except straight. Got everything nicely laid out here. Going with battery strap option for the GPS, because with this mount there's not a lot of room in the back here. So this can go up top on the battery strap. Everything's in its place. We've got the ESC conformal coated, got the flight controller conformal coated. We are going to start we're going to tin the leads for the receiver and then wire up the receiver first.
In an effort to save time and clarify things here, I'm going to walk you through the wiring for the flight controller using some diagrams. First thing I'll go over is the camera, what we're doing with the camera. So with the camera, we're taking the VCC wire and we're sending that to the 5-volt pad on the Unify. The ground is going to the ground pad on the Unify, and V out will be going to the flight controller's V in port. After that, we're going to do the buzzer. The buzzer ground port will go to flight controller ground, obviously. 5-volt to a 5-volt port on the flight controller, probably the one bottom right. And the buzz pad will go to the buzz minus pad right next to that 5-volt port. The receiver also needs 5 volts, so its 5 volt is going to go to the 5 volt on the left side bottom of the flight controller. The ground will go to the ground nearby there. Channel 1 on the receiver goes to RX6 and channel 2 goes to TX6. Next up we have got the Unify. It takes 7 to 26 volts in, and so we're going to get that from the B plus pad in the top left. The ground is going to go to the ground pad nearby there. The 5-volt out pad on the Unify will be powering the camera. The ground associated with that will go to the camera ground. Video out on the Unify will go to the VO pad on the flight controller, and to get smart audio, Crossfire RX1 will be going to the TX1 pad on the flight controller. The GPS, in order to get that working, ground will go to the ground on the flight controller in the top left. TX goes to RX2. RX goes to TX2. And we'll be getting 5 volts for that. The VCC will connect to the 5-volt pad in the top left. And that's all the wiring.
So that's all the wiring done. Everything is in position, ready to go. Now we just have to plug it in and see if it works. So before we plug this thing in, continuity test, just so we don't fry something if we don't have to. To do a continuity test, you take your multi-tool, switch it to this one here, and when you do that, when you touch these together, if it beeps, that means there is free-flowing continuity between the leads you're touching. So we're going to go to ground and then touch all the leads and just make sure that there's no connection. So it all looks good and it's ready. Never plug in power to your video transmitter, or any transmitter for that matter, without an antenna on there. Smoke stopper. Now we're just looking for no smoke, and this green light should stay on. Cool, the beeper works too. Alright, so here it is. Oh boy, it was a tough build. Tougher than I thought it would be anyway. This was supposed to be a cakewalk because I've built one of these before, but this was more challenging than I figured it would be.
If you did find this video helpful, like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video in this series. It's the maiden flight of this thing. So thanks a lot.